Hello everybody, today we are interviewing Professor Rupert Wegerif, who is Professor of Education at the Faculty of Education, University of Cambridge, and has done decades of work on dialogue. Just Professor Wegerif, would you like to add anything to that? Could you tell us a little bit about your work on dialogic education?
Yes, it really has been decades. It started about 30 years ago this year, when I started working with Neil Mercer as my supervisor in the Open University, and also with Lynn Dawes in her school. So we were working on real problems where we found that to get children to learn more when talking together in groups around computers, we could teach them ways of talking, which really helped develop their learning and their understanding. And by doing that, of course, it made me think about education. Just looking at the videos, I saw it was a little bit more than just the talk that was somehow leading to the learning. It was the relationship. It was the opening of dialogic space, which we might discuss. And so that led me to think about the importance of dialogic education in general, as education as expanding, dialogue increasingly important with technology in the internet age, where there was so many perspectives. So I went on from that to run projects developing technology to support dialogue across difference, and also to write books about educational theory as dialogic education. Is that a reasonable answer, Farah? I don't know. It's why don't you just Google me if you're interested, you know?
Yeah, I mean, I think you've done a very good short introduction to what is a huge amount of work, but could I ask you to just explain a little bit about what you mean by this term dialogic space?
Yes, well, looking at these videos of children talking together, sometimes you saw that before they had a creative solution, I was actually giving them problems with answers, but we had lots of different kinds of talk. There was often this sort of pregnant pause, silence, and I realized that in a sense that space was just as important as the actual words, that any word only means in resonance with other words. There's a divergence in perspective, so that what they were learning in the dialogue wasn't just the specific words or positions, but to that space of potential out of which new ideas emerge. I don't know if that makes sense. In a way, it's a very simple idea that whenever you have two or three perspectives, you have a kind of field of possibilities, and a dialogue is opening up that field of possibilities.
Okay, no, that's really interesting. So I suppose what you mean, what you mean is that actually the meaning that's given to one person's contribution, the dialogue, is shaped very much by the rest of the contributions. So that space is the interaction between those two things. Is that right?
Partly, but it's also that any word or anything, that an audible word or a visible sign, it only means anything in relation to other things around it, the background. So partly that's the divergence from other people's voices, other people's perspectives, but it's also emerging from an implicit background. And unless that background is shared, you know, you don't really have a dialogue. So the dialogue is the kind of resonances. Sometimes things merge together, sometimes they clash. And it's only out of that implicit space of potential meaning that new meanings can emerge. I think it sounds a bit vague, but in real life, I'm sure we're all aware that as well as the words, there's the kind of the space or potential around them that we have to share in a dialogue. Shared assumptions, perhaps.
Great, thank you. So just moving on from that a little bit, another concept that you talk about in your work is dialogic self. Okay, so we can understand that when there's a dialogue is happening, there's a space emerging, or that space is something that is through which the dialogue is happening. But then what do you mean when you then start talking about a dialogic self? So then now you're coming out of this space and you're talking about just an individual person. Could you explain that?
No, it's pretty much the same idea. It's that, as I say, we have this idea of the self as an individual person, but actually, you know, in a dialogue, when I'm listening to your voice, I'm in a sense incarnating your voice. So the self is always multiple. A dialogic self is one where you're not just identifying with your own speaking voice, that in some sense you're double voiced. You have two identities at the same time. You speak, but you also listen to yourself speaking as if from the other person's point of view. But it's not just a specific person. Like, no, I'm not really just talking to Farah. I'm talking out to all of you, whoever's listening to this. And in order to be able to speak clearly, I have to, in a sense, hear myself speaking as if from the point of view of the dialogue. So in a way, this dialogic self is the same idea as a dialogic space, if that makes any sense.
No, I can see what you mean. So I think what you're saying is that recognizing that you're never only thinking for yourself, you're always thinking as if you're speaking to somebody else. And that recognition means that you're more aware of that sort of twofold process of what's happening in your own thoughts.
Yes, let's go back to a practical example. So when we're looking at these children talking together in primary classrooms, sometimes they didn't think very well because they were quite egotistical. They all just wanted to get the answer. They didn't listen to each other. Sometimes they didn't think very well because they all agreed with each other. So it was just like groupthink. But the best kind of talk was when they changed their mind. They questioned themselves. They said, oh, no, you're right. It could be something else. And in a way, they're identifying there with the shared dialogue. So as a self, in their identification, they're not just identifying with their ego. They're not just identifying with the group. They're sort of double. They're both a speaking voice, but amongst others. They identify with the dialogue as well as identifying with their own voice. You know, there's always a tension, a resonance, or, well, a creative tension, shall we say, between talking and listening.
Okay, so
did that work?
Yes,
Does that make sense?
it does. It does. Thank you. It's very helpful. So I suppose what you're saying is that in a way, that's a way of understanding how you can widen and deepen. So you talk about widening and deepening dialogue. And particularly I'd be interested in this idea of widening, deepening and expanding the dialogic space in relation to across cultures. So could you talk a little bit about your work in sort of cross-cultural dialogue?
Yes, so in a way, it is all about identity. So we're talking about self-identity, not as some closed thing, closed off from others, but a dialogic identity where you can actually, to some extent, identify with multiple voices. So you're expanding your own self-understanding. The widening is a very simple idea that on given any topic, there was going to be a range of perspectives. If you Google anything now, you'll find a range of different views on it, including, you know, the most abstruse scientific topics. But the deepening is linked to the widening. It's when you actually have to question the framing to go further. I tried to think of some examples, and when I came up, we're now talking about dialogue, and this is part of a MOOC on dialogue, isn't it? So you can widen it. You can talk to Neil Mercer and Sarah Hennessy, and you can get all the different views. But maybe you talk to somebody who starts talking about dialogue in movement or dialogue in music. Well, that would tend to lead to a deepening move where you question the framing assumption that it's all about talk, and that might expand the dialogic field around dialogue, to illustrate that. So in a way, that's the aim of education. It's to expand dialogue, and it's very much about, in doing that, you should become aware of your own history, your own cultural assumptions, because everybody is understanding things through a frame that they're kind of given. And the dialogue with other voices should enable you to attain a certain intellectual humility, to realize that it might be possible to learn something from others, because it doesn't mean you abandon your culture or your frame, but you become more aware of it. You suddenly realize that I'm only able to speak because I have a language, because I have these assumptions. And so I think it has a lot of importance for intercultural dialogue in a way.
I think
as you say.
no, that's a really important point. And as people, you know, if we're looking at the notion of dialogue, certainly be something that we should be thinking about is that our assumptions about what that might mean will be very different in a different cultural context. And, you know, we live in a globalized world, so we're trying to educate children or young people to think about things in a globalized kind of way. So this is very important. But then somebody might think, okay, that's all fine and well for like certain subjects, and it might fit really well, but would this be really relevant? Your ideas of dialogic space and dialogic self, are these really relevant for all teachers? So for example, a science teacher or a computing teacher, would this be of some relevance to them?
Oh yes, absolutely. Of course, I'm not opposing the idea of direct teaching. Clearly, sometimes there are things that you need to teach that aren't a matter of debate or dialogue, but debate and dialogue isn't just about the debate between different cultures in history or literature or politics. It's also an essential way of understanding anything, really. And people sometimes treat science as the transmission of true things, but that's not really what science is. Science is an ongoing debate where you have provisional, temporary, this is the best thing we know now. But to understand that, you have to understand the dialogue it comes out of. You have to contrast it to the alternatives. So for understanding, what understanding really means is you're able to explain it to a range of different people in a range of different contexts. And that's where this idea of a dialogic space becomes quite useful. You have to know, well, what are the range of different views? What are the range of different theories and different ways of doing it? So even in maths, you know, to understand multiplication, well, what are the range of different ways I could do this? So that you kind of know what you're doing, and then you might possibly later on be able to creatively take the field forward and come up with new ways. So the dialogue is a kind of essential to creative understanding in any subject area, I think. And I'm sure not everyone would agree, but I think it's the understanding bit that is where dialogue comes in.
Well, certainly, I mean, in my experience, when you watch a group of children trying to solve a problem, and then through that dialogue, through that engagement with each other, when the penny drops for one of them, you know, it's a lovely moment to see when they begin to actually try and solve that problem because of the way they've worked together. So that would be presumably a dialogic process, an opening up of dialogic space, and some interaction of themselves as dialogic cells interacting with each other. So I think that would bring a lot of the concepts that we're trying to sort of break down together in a concrete example. So yeah, so I think, I mean, those were all my questions. I don't know if you wanted to add anything before we finish up.
Perhaps you mentioned the intercultural situation, and I didn't fully outline the vision I had is that with the internet now, we really have got a bit of a problem. We have all these different voices, and young people aren't necessarily being prepared to cope with it. So the dialogic education with the internet, with technology, becomes a crucial way of at least preparing for a better planet in the future, you know, for avoiding all these misunderstandings and conflicts, and developing a kind of shared consciousness, a shared identity where obviously everybody acknowledges and respects the differences, but can work together. So that's partly where the intercultural joins with the technology, if you see what I mean. Essential education for the internet age is how I would put it.
Okay, no, thanks. Thank you for outlining that. And for people who are interested, Rupert's now heading up the Digital Education Futures Initiative, which is based at Hughes Hall in the University of Cambridge. So that's our entire project looking at, amongst other things, dialogue and technology. So we'll leave it there. Thank you so much, Rupert, for your time. We know you're very busy and you have a lot of things to do. So we're very grateful that you took the time to share your ideas and thoughts with us. Thank you very much.
Oh, it's a pleasure, Farah. Thanks for asking. And so do follow up if anyone's interested.